Welcome to Lecture 11, Africa and International Relations. Introduction. Africa is the central focus of this course. To this end, there is a need for us to examine the interactions of African countries with other countries in the international arena. In this lecture, we shall examine Africa's external relations. Objectives. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to describe Africa's relations with the rest of the world. Explain the various factors that influence these relations. Content. Africa occupies a very strategic position in the world. The creation of modern African states has to be located within the context of the continent's history. The impact of colonial rule has direct relevance on the conduct of international relations by African states, both during the colonial era as well as in the post-independence phase. The Berlin Conference of 1885 essentially formalized the scramble and partition of Africa, and as a matter of fact, transferred the sovereign authority of African nations or states to European colonialists. In the conduct of foreign and international relations, therefore, this meant that African states did not have the equal status accorded all states under the doctrine of sovereignty. They could therefore not independently conduct their affairs with others without the express approval of the metropolitan regimes in Europe. It is significant to note that international instruments such as the UN Charter, which guarantees sovereign equality of all states, was adopted in 1945 at a time when most states in Africa were still under colonial rule. With independence, African states could now decide for themselves the direction of their foreign and international relations. They could also use their new status to influence debates in key international fora such as the UN General Assembly, the Non-Aligned Movement, and so on a variety of global issues. There are a number of global factors that influence Africa's relationships with other countries in the post-colonial era. These include relationship with former colonial power, international influence. There are a number of global factors that influence Africans' relationships with other countries in the post-colonial era. These include relationship with former colonial power. In most cases, from independence, most African countries have continued to maintain close relationship with their former colonial masters. For example, after Senegal became independent in 1960, the government developed a close relationship with France. Likewise, Nigeria maintains a close relationship with Britain. After all, many African countries had to struggle against European colonial powers to achieve political independence. However, there were many economic, social, and political connections between newly independent countries and their former rulers. These connections influenced the foreign policies and relations of the newly independent countries. In the post-colonial era, most of the former colonial countries tried to foster close relationships with their former colonies. This is particularly true in the case of Britain and France, the two largest colonial powers. Britain went as far as to form what is called the Commonwealth of Nations, all former British colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas are eligible for membership. The primary goal of the Commonwealth is to promote closer ties between these nations. Currently, the Commonwealth of Nations has a membership of 54 sovereign nations and 26 dependencies, making it one of the largest transcontinental organizations of states, smaller than only the United Nations and the Non-Aligned Movement. France has been even more closely engaged with most of its former colonies in Africa. The French government fosters the idea of basic cultural unity between regions of the world influenced by French rule, language, and culture. La francophonie is a term that French give to this concept of solidarity of French-speaking people in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Geopolitical global politics. The end of World War II in 1945 led to very important changes in world history and in the structure of relationships between nation-states. The post-World War II era world witnessed the division of the world into two sets of geopolitical groups of nation-states. First, East-West division. Two countries emerged at the end of the war as new global superpowers, the United States (USA) and the Soviet Union (USSR). In such a situation, it is natural that competition developed between the two new global powers. However, the tension that developed between these two superpowers was accentuated by great differences in ideology. The US championed democratic capitalism. The USSR championed democratic socialism. Since the United States is located in the Western Hemisphere and most of its allies were in Western Europe, this geopolitical alliance became identified as the West or Western Bloc of nations. Similarly, since the USSR and most of its allies were located in Eastern Europe, this alliance was identified as the East or Eastern Bloc of nations. The strong tension between the US and USSR is widely referred to as the Cold War, since the tensions never developed into an actual warfare between the West and the East. However, even if the USA and USSR never went to war, competition between the two blocs resulted in a series of wars in Asia and Africa. North-South division. World War II pitted the Allied forces against the evils of Nazism and fascism. During World War II, the Allied powers asserted that they were fighting for liberty and freedom for all people. Indeed, in 1941, just after the US joined the war, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill of Britain signed the Atlantic Charter, a document that outlined the principles for which the Allies were fighting. During the post-war period, the economies of the US, Japan, and former colonial powers in Europe flourished. All of these countries are situated in the Northern Hemisphere. However, political independence and the end of colonialism did not bring results in immediate economic, social, and political development in Africa. Moreover, many of the colonial countries in Asia, Latin America, or Africa were situated south of the developed countries. Over the past 30 years, the political and economic gap between the countries of the North and the former colonial countries of the South has grown, such that African diplomats spend much of their time negotiating with the North for debt reduction, much needed new financial assistance, and fairer trade policies. Cold War in Africa. Political independence for most African countries came during the height of the Cold War tensions between East and West, in spite of their close connection to the former colonial powers in Europe, all of which belonged to the Western Bloc. Most of the newly independent African governments wanted to stay neutral in the Cold War. Many of the new African leaders were attracted to the idea of non-alignment that was championed by newly independent countries in Asia, the Caribbean, Africa, as well as some countries in Latin America that had been independent for a longer time. The core idea of non-alignment is to be neutral, not to take sides in the Cold War. Proponents of non-alignment were convinced that the survival of their nation-states depended on their neutrality between the Eastern and Western blocs. So attractive was the idea on non-alignment that nations from Asia, the Americas, and Africa joined together to form the Non-Allied Movement, which by the 1980s had a membership of 77 independent countries. However, in spite of their best attempts to remain non-allied, African governments were not always strong enough to resist being drawn into the conflict between the USA and the Soviet Union. The nature of African involvement in the Cold War varied. At times, African governments would side with one of the two superpowers in a vote at the United Nations, or African countries praised the Soviet Union for its stand against racism and apartheid in Southern Africa, and criticized the US for not offering strong enough condemnation of apartheid. Far more serious are the examples of African countries that suffered from violence and civil strife as a result of their being drawn into the Cold War competition between the two superpowers. Indeed, in Angola, the Congo, Zaire, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Somalia, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, the Cold War turned into hot wars. Governments were overthrown, political and economic systems destroyed, tens of thousands of people were killed, many more injured, and millions became refugees in their own country or in neighboring countries. Internal factors. The African nations remain the most troubled in the world, politically, socially, economically, with many of the least developed nations being in Africa. Some of these poorest countries of the world are in Africa, and many remain perpetually paralyzed with problems of starvation and poverty, HIV and widespread illnesses, and political corruption or human rights abuse. These problems affect Africa's relations with other parts of the world. As a result of widespread corruption, many business people are wary of investing in the continent. However, in spite of all these problems, Africa still holds a strategic position in the world. As we continue with the lectures, you will get to realize the importance of Africa in the world. Summary: Africa holds a strategic position in the world. Factors that influence Africa's relationships with other countries include relationship with former colonial power, geopolitical global politics, Cold War, poverty, violent conflict, and so on. End of lecture 11. Thanks for listening.